Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, tell me, is there anything cozier than a rainy evening with a good story? Share what a perfect rainy day looks like for you. I truly enjoy reading your comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Now settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. A Change in the Wind. The sky above Loch Dubh had turned the colour of an old bruise. Hamish Macbeth stood in the doorway of the Loch Dubh police station, a modest whitewashed building that served equally well as his home, his office, and on the rare occasion that Sergeant McGregor came sniffing from Strathbane, a place he was obliged to look busy, and watch the clouds roll in from the Atlantic with the unhurried menace of a debt collector who knows you have no back door. Lugg sat beside him, the big, odd-looking dog with the enormous ears that gave him his name, and regarded the horizon with an expression that could only be described as philosophical. Luggs was not a dog who panicked. He had, over the years, survived storms, visiting relatives of Hamish's mother, and a particularly unpleasant encounter with a badger, and he had emerged from each of these trials with his dignity more or less intact. He leaned now against Hamish's leg and let out a long, slow breath through his nose. "Aye," said Hamish, who understood him perfectly. "I know." The forecast had been grim all week. The Met Office, that grand institution which Hamish privately suspected was staffed entirely by pessimists, had issued warnings of a fierce Atlantic storm expected to arrive by Thursday evening and stay, unwelcome as a mother-in-law, through at least the weekend. Already the fishing boats had been pulled up onto the shingle, and old Sumus MacDonald had nailed extra boards across the windows of his bait shop, which he only ever did when things were going to be very bad indeed, or when his sister from Inverness was visiting, the two events being, in Sumus's estimation, roughly equivalent in terms of suffering. Hamish had grown up in the Highlands. He understood storms the way other men understood trains, when they were coming, how long they would last, and whether it was worth trying to outrun them. This one, he could tell, was not to be outrun. He had felt it in his joints since Tuesday, and the sky this morning had confirmed it. A low, swollen purple that pressed down over the loch and the mountains like a lid on a pot that was beginning to boil. He went inside, put the kettle on, and was just settling himself at his desk with a biscuit and the newspaper, when Lugg's ears rose slightly, a movement so subtle that only Hamish would have noticed it, and the creak of a car on the single-track road announced the arrival of someone new to Loch Dubh. The Loch Dubh Hotel, he knew, had been filling since yesterday. He had heard about it from Nessie Curry, who had heard about it from Angela Brodie, who kept the post office and whose husband's cousin had spoken to Willie Lamont, who helped at the hotel and saw everything. An unusual collection of guests by all accounts, drawn in by the storm and by whatever private purposes brought strangers to a village at the edge of the world. The first of them Hamish had encountered himself, walking along the waterfront that morning with the sort of purposeful stride that announced, without ambiguity, a man who intended to matter. He was perhaps 60, with a broad, well-fed face, the expensive outdoor clothing of a man who had never actually been outdoors, and the loud, confident voice of someone who had never truly had to listen to anyone else. "You're the local copper, are you?" the man had said, looking Hamish up and down with frank assessment. "I am," Hamish had agreed pleasantly. "Hamish Macbeth, and you would be." Julian Hathersage. The name was offered like a business card, as though it should mean something. "I'm up here looking at development opportunities. Extraordinary place you've got. Wasted, frankly." Hamish had kept his expression mild and his tongue still, both of which required some effort. He had heard talk of Hathersage, as it happened, a property developer from the south who had made his fortune in what estate agents called regeneration and what local people more accurately called demolition, reconstruction, and the arrival of coffee shops where there had previously been fishmongers. Hathersage had reportedly been casting his eye over several Highland communities, drawn by the same quality that had always drawn outsiders to this part of the world, its beauty, which he immediately interpreted as an untapped resource. "It's a fishing village," Hamish had said. "It's been a fishing village for several hundred years. "Which is exactly the problem," Hathersage had replied, and strolled away. Hamish had watched him go with a feeling he could not quite name. Not hostility, exactly. More the feeling one gets when one notices that a window has been left open during the night, and the cold has already crept in, and it is too late to undo it. By midday the hotel was full, and Hamish, whose business it was to know everything that happened in Lochdu, had made it his business to know about its guests. Mrs. Elspeth Hathersage had arrived with her husband in a large black car, and had said almost nothing since. She was a pale woman, well-dressed, with careful eyes that moved quickly around a room and settled on nothing. She smiled when spoken to, but it was the smile of someone who had learned to deploy it automatically, like a reflex. Willie Lamont, who had carried her bags, reported that she had tipped generously and said thank you very quietly, as though she was not quite sure she was allowed to speak. Dr. Fiona McRae was a different sort altogether. She was a marine biologist from Edinburgh, here on her own account to study the patterns of coastal erosion along the bay, and she had the brisk, cheerful manner of a woman who was accustomed to working alone in difficult conditions and rather enjoyed it. She wore practical clothes and sensible boots, and had already, by noon, been down to the shore twice with a notebook and a camera, pausing only to argue briefly but brilliantly with Hathersage over the likely environmental impact of large-scale hotel construction on the local shingle ecosystem, a subject on which she clearly knew a great deal more than he did. Angus Grant, unlike the others, needed no introduction. He was a Lochdu man, born and bred, a fisherman of the old school with a weather-beaten face, and the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who measured time by tides rather than clocks. He had nodded to Hamish on the waterfront and said little, which was normal for Angus, and gone about his business in his usual quiet way. He was staying at the hotel only because his cottage was having its roof repaired, a project that had been underway for some months and showed no signs of concluding, and he bore the inconvenience with the stoic patience that is the particular inheritance of men who spend their lives at the mercy of weather and engines that start when they choose to. Miss Katrina Vale was younger than Hamish had expected from her name, which sounded like it should belong to someone's aunt. She was perhaps 35, with sharp, clever eyes, and the slightly over-attentive manner of someone who was always just slightly taking notes. She described herself as a travel writer searching for authentic Highland stories, and she had already, within hours of arrival, asked every person in the hotel dining room at least one question, and managed to make each of them feel that they were the most interesting person she had ever met. Hamish, who knew something about charm and its uses, watched her with mild interest. Colonel Douglas Kerr was the last of them to register, arriving in a hired car from Inverness in the early afternoon, with a single bag and the quiet, self-contained manner of a man accustomed to making himself at home in uncomfortable places. He was in his late 60s, upright and lean, with a military moustache and the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over a long career, the value of watching without appearing to watch. He had acknowledged Hamish with a brief, precise nod, and said he was here for some fishing and to escape the city for a few days, which was reason enough, and asked no further questions. And then there was Lena Brodie. Hamish had recognised her name before he saw her face, and her face, when he did see it, confirmed what the name had suggested. She was Margaret Brodie's daughter, who had left Lochdu some 10 years ago, under circumstances that no one had quite fully explained, and that everyone in the village had been explaining to each other ever since. She'd gone south to work, that much was agreed upon. Beyond that, the accounts diverged. She was back now, she said, for personal reasons, and she said it in the firm, quiet tone of someone who had prepared for the question and did not intend to answer any follow-up. Hamish stood at the door of the hotel that evening as the first serious rain began to fall, tapping his cap against his thigh and watching the wind move across the surface of the loch. Behind him, through the thick stone walls and the fogged windows, he could hear the low competing sounds of conversation and the clink of glasses. Lugg sat beside him and regarded the darkening water. A strange collection, Hamish said thoughtfully. Lugg's offered no opinion, He had learned over the years to reserve judgment. In Lochdub, as he well knew, it rarely paid to decide too early what anything was. The storm was coming. That much, at least, was certain. Chapter 2. The Gathering. The rain arrived properly by 6 o'clock, not with any drama, but with the quiet, relentless determination of something that had made up its mind. It came in off the Atlantic in long grey sheets, and within the hour the loch had lost its colour entirely, becoming a flat pewter expanse that reflected nothing, and the mountains behind the village had retreated behind cloud until they were no more than a darker suggestion of grey against grey. The single-track road that wound north out of Lochdub toward the main road began to run with water, and the gutters along the high street, which Hamish had been meaning to report to the council for the better part of 2 years, proved once again to be entirely inadequate for the purpose for which they were supposedly designed. He had moved Luggs's basket to the back room, away from the draught under the front door, and was considering whether there was anything useful to be done outside when the phone rang. It was Sergeant McGregor from Strathbane, calling to remind him, in the tone of a man who suspects the reminder will be ignored, that should any incidents arise over the course of the storm, Hamish was to document them properly and not, as he had done on a previous occasion, write the whole thing up on the back of a feed invoice. Hamish said yes, of course. He would do no such thing, which satisfied McGregor, and then went to find his waterproof, which was hung over the back of a chair in the kitchen, and was still slightly damp from that morning. He walked up to the hotel through the rain because, as he told himself honestly, it was his duty to check on the visitors, and not at all because he was curious about what was happening in that warm-lit dining room behind the steamed-up windows. Both things were true, and Hamish had long ago made peace with the fact that, in his experience, professional duty and personal curiosity tended to arrive at the same destination by different routes. The hotel was run by Mr. and Mrs. MacPhail, a couple whose long marriage had achieved the particular equilibrium of two people who had argued about absolutely everything, and arrived, through sheer exhaustion, at a kind of contentment. Mrs. MacPhail had decided, given the circumstances, to offer a communal dinner rather than room service, both because it was more practical and because, as she told Hamish in a low voice while taking his wet jacket, she thought it better to have them all where she could see them. He didn't ask her what she meant by that. He suspected she was not entirely sure herself, and that it was simply the instinct of a woman who had housed a great many strangers and developed, over the years, a certain sensitivity to atmospheres. The dining room held them all. Hathersage had claimed the table nearest the fire, which surprised no one, and was holding forth to no one in particular about the transformative potential of boutique Highland tourism, pausing occasionally to drain his wineglass with the enthusiasm of a man who was thoroughly enjoying the sound of his own voice. His wife sat beside him in the way of a piece of furniture that has been placed carefully in a corner, present, decorative in a faded way, and entirely invisible to the room's occupant. Dr. MacRae was seated across the table with a glass of red wine and the politely incredulous expression of a person who has heard something quite astonishingly wrong, but is choosing for the moment to let it pass. She did not let it pass for long. "The erosion patterns along this bay," she said, in the pleasant conversational tone one might use to observe that the soup was perhaps slightly oversalted, "are already at a critical threshold. Any significant construction along the lower shoreline would accelerate them considerably. We'd be talking about the loss of the shingle habitat within a decade." Hathersage waved this away with the large gesture of a man dismissing an inconvenience. "Studies can always be commissioned to show whatever one needs them to show," he said. "That's rather the point of them." Dr. MacRae looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has just discovered something unexpected under a stone. "That is," she said carefully, "a remarkable thing to say out loud." Hathersage laughed, which was worse. Angus Grant sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, but his hands, resting flat on the tablecloth, had gone quite still, and the stillness was of the variety that precedes movement rather than follows it. He was a man who had fished these waters for 40 years. He knew the bay, the shingle, the pull of the tide through the rocks below the old jetty, as well as he knew his own hands. What Hathersage was proposing was not, to Angus, an abstract environmental question. It was personal in the way that only places can be personal when a man has worked them so long that they have become part of his own geography. He said nothing, but he listened to everything. Later, while Mrs. MacPhail was bringing round the pudding and the fire had burned down to a steady orange warmth, Hamish observed two things from his position near the door, where he had settled with a cup of tea and the useful invisibility that a uniformed policeman sometimes achieves by holding very still and looking amiable. The first was that Lena Brodie had slipped out of the dining room at some point after the main course, and had not come back. The second was that Hathersage had followed her, at an interval just long enough to appear coincidental. Hamish waited. He was good at waiting. Hathersage returned after perhaps 12 minutes, smoothing his jacket with the satisfaction of a man who has concluded an unpleasant piece of business. Lena came back a few minutes after that. Her face was composed, but she poured herself a full glass of wine immediately upon sitting down, which suggested that the composure was requiring some effort to maintain. At the other end of the table, Colonel Kerr watched Hathersage's return with an attention that was wholly unlike idle curiosity. He had been watching Hathersage all evening, Hamish now realised, with the focused, patient observation of a man who's waited a long time for something, and is now alert to the possibility that it may be about to arrive. Katrina Vale leaned toward Angus Grant and said something that made him glance sharply at her, then away. She took out a small notebook, a reflex apparently, so ingrained she may not have noticed she was doing it, and then, catching herself, put it away again. "Extraordinary weather," she said pleasantly to the room, which was the sort of remark that was entirely accurate and entirely meaningless, and which served the purpose of changing a subject that had not technically been raised. Outside, the rain intensified. Hamish could hear it on the roof now, a sustained drumming weight, and the windows had begun to flex slightly in their frames with each gust. He made his excuses to Mrs. MacPhail, put on his still-damp waterproof, and stepped outside into the darkness. The wind had a direction to it now, a steady westerly push that meant the worst was still some hours away. He paused on the step and looked back through the fogged window at the figures inside, rendered soft and indistinct by the glass and the condensation. Angus Grant was going out early tomorrow morning, storm or not, to check his lobster pots. Hamish knew this because Angus had mentioned it to him on the waterfront matter-of-factly, in the way of a man reporting a simple and unalterable fact. Hamish pulled his collar up and walked home through the rain. He told himself there was nothing wrong, which was a sign, in his experience, that he was not quite sure of it. Chapter 3. What the Fisherman Saw. The storm broke fully at 2:30 in the morning. Hamish knew the precise time because it woke him, not with a single dramatic crash, but with a sustained escalation of sound that moved through the walls of the police station like something alive. First the deep, resonant moan of the wind finding the gaps and corners of the building, then the hard percussion of rain against glass, and then, underneath both of those, the low, rhythmic boom of the sea. He lay still for a moment in the dark and listened. Luggs had climbed onto the foot of the bed, which he was not supposed to do, and had arranged himself with the comfortable certainty of a dog who knows that some rules are suspended during emergencies. Hamish did not move him. There was no question of going back to sleep after that. He got up, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table in the darkness with a mug of tea, while the storm conducted itself outside with enormous indifferent energy. At some point, the lights flickered twice and went out. He found the torch in the drawer where he usually kept it, which was unusual enough that he took a moment to appreciate it, and settled in to wait out the worst of it. By the time a grey, grudging dawn began to press itself through the kitchen window, the wind had dropped to something merely fierce, the rain had thinned, and the telephone line was silent. He lifted the receiver, heard nothing, and set it down again with the equanimity of a man who had been expecting precisely this outcome. The road north was almost certainly flooded at the low point past the Sutherland farm. He would check it when it was properly light. He was pulling on his boots when Angus Grant came to the door. Hamish had known Angus for the whole of his time in Lockdown, which was now long enough that he could no longer quite imagine the village without him. He knew Angus as a man of minimal expression and maximal reliability, a man whose face, through long exposure to Highland weather, had acquired the quality of the landscape itself, weathered, patient, disclosing nothing that it had not decided to disclose. In 20 years, Hamish had seen Angus Grant surprised perhaps 3 times. He had never seen him like this. The fisherman stood in the doorway with water running from his oilskins and his face the colour of old ash. His eyes had the particular look of a man who has seen something his mind is still working to classify. Not fear exactly, but the immediate precursor to it, the sharp cognitive discomfort of an experience that does not fit into any existing category. "Come in," Hamish said, stepping back. Angus came in. He did not take off his oilskins. He stood in the kitchen and dripped on the floor, and looked at a point somewhere between himself and the far wall. "Sit down," Hamish said. "I'll make tea." Angus sat. The tea was made and set in front of him, and half drunk before Angus spoke. Hamish waited through all of this without hurrying him, because he knew from long experience that a man like Angus Grant could not be rushed toward a thing he was not yet ready to say, and that rushing him would only make it take longer. "I went out 5, Angus said at last, "to check the pots. I know what you're going to say." "I'm not going to say anything," Hamish said mildly. "You're a grown man and you know these waters better than I do." Angus looked at him briefly, then away. "The storm had eased enough," he said. "I've been out in worse." This was true, and both of them knew it. "I came back along the shore below the road. It's easier in a swell, you keep to the rocks." Hamish nodded and said nothing. "Near the old jetty," Angus said, and stopped. The old jetty was a remnant of the village's older life, a stone and timber structure that had not been in regular use for the better part of 30 years, standing at the far end of the bay where the shore curved inward beneath a low headland. It was the sort of place that served, in good weather, as a perch for teenagers, and in bad weather, as a destination for nobody at all. "Near the old jetty," Hamish prompted gently. "There was someone there." Angus turned his mug on the table. "Down on the foreshore, below the jetty itself. I nearly didn't see them. The light was still bad, and the spray was coming in off the rocks. But I saw them clearly enough." He paused. "They were dragging something heavy." "Could you make out who it was?" Angus shook his head. "The light was wrong. They had their back to the water." He hesitated. "I thought it was just... I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought perhaps it was something fallen from the jetty, storm damage, timber, or rope, or..." He stopped again. His hands were quite flat on the table. "But now you're thinking otherwise," Hamish said. Angus said nothing, which was its own answer. Hamish put on his waterproof, told Lugs to stay. Lugs offered the brief, reproachful look of a dog who wishes to register a formal objection before complying, and walked with Angus down to the shore. The aftermath of the storm lay across Loughdoob like the evidence of some vast, careless house-guest. Debris on the high street, branches across the road, a section of garden wall collapsed entirely into somebody's front garden. The bay was still heaving with a residual chop, brown and unsettled, and the tide line was heaped with weed and broken timber and things that had been somewhere else yesterday. They found Julian Hathersage below the old jetty. He was lying face down on the shingle at the water's edge, one arm extended as though he had been reaching for something just out of his grasp. The back of his skull bore a wound that was not consistent with a simple fall, though the rocks nearby offered a plausible explanation to anyone inclined to accept one. His expensive outdoor clothing was soaked through, and his face, when Hamish carefully turned him, wore the vacant expression of a man to whom everything had become, quite suddenly, a matter of complete indifference. Hamish crouched on his heels for a long time, and looked at everything around the body without touching anything he did not need to touch. The shingle had been disturbed in a wide arc, though the storm and the tide had done their work on any finer detail. The jetty above was sound enough, no obvious damage, No missing timber, no indication that anyone had fallen from it accidentally. He stood up and looked at Angus, who was standing a few feet away with his arms at his sides and his face absolutely still. "You'll need to go back to the hotel," Hamish said. Angus looked at him steadily. "The road's flooded and the phone lines are down," Hamish continued, in the calm, measured tone he used when he was thinking hard about several things at once, and did not want anyone to know it. "I'll need you to stay there. I'll need everyone to stay there." Angus nodded. He understood. Hamish looked back down at Julian Hathersage, at the shape he made against the grey shingle, at the particular stillness of a man for whom the storm had turned out to be the least of his problems. He thought of the figure Angus had described, dragging something heavy along the foreshore in the half-dark of a Highland dawn. He thought of the dining room the night before and the fire and the careful, watchful faces arranged around the table. There was no forensics team coming, no backup from Strathbane, no detective inspector arriving from Inverness with a sergeant and a scene of crime kit, and the comfortable institutional machinery of a proper murder inquiry. There was Lockdoob, cut off from the world, holding everyone it contained, and there was Hamish Macbeth, who would have to be enough. Chapter 4. No Way Out. Hamish walked back to the hotel alone. Angus had gone ahead, moving along the shore path with the automatic, mechanical stride of a man who needed to be doing something with his legs, while his mind worked through what he had just seen. Hamish let him go. He needed the 10 minutes of grey, wind-scoured solitude to arrange his thoughts before he walked into that building and became, for however long it took, the only authority that Lockdoob possessed. He had covered the body with his waterproof jacket, which was the best he could do under the circumstances, and weighted the corners with stones against the remnant wind. It was not, as procedures went, textbook. But there was no textbook for this particular situation, and Hamish had long ago come to the working conclusion that common sense, applied steadily and without panic, was a reasonable substitute for most things. He paused at the hotel door and looked back at the village. The lock was still, the stormlight picking out the colours of the wet stone in muted, pewtery detail. A beautiful place, as it always was, indifferent as always to whatever its inhabitants were doing to one another. He had chosen this life, the village, the station, the quiet daily rhythms of a constable who was, by any measure, considerably underemployed for his abilities, as Strathbane never tired of pointing out, and he had chosen it knowingly, with open eyes. He loved it with the uncomplicated, undefended love of a man who has found the place where he belongs and has the good sense to stay there. He pushed open the door and went inside. They were gathered in the dining room, all of them, drawn there by Angus's return, and by the instinct that gathers people together in the presence of news they have not yet received but can already feel. Mrs. MacPhail stood near the sideboard with a tea-towel in her hands, which she was folding and unfolding with the concentrated attention of a woman who needed something to do with them. Willie Lamont had stationed himself near the kitchen door, and was doing a reasonable impression of someone who was simply there by coincidence. Hamish looked at the 5 faces arranged before him. Elspeth Hathersage sat very upright in the chair nearest the window, her hands in her lap, her face composed in a way that suggested composition was costing her something. When Hamish came in, she looked at him with immediate direct attention, and something in her expression, not hope exactly, but its first distant cousin, shifted and then steadied. Lena Brodie had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and was staring at the tablecloth. She did not look up when he entered. Dr. MacRae was standing rather than sitting, her back to the cold fireplace, in the posture of someone who has been waiting with useful activity rather than anxious idleness, and has run out of useful activity to perform. Colonel Kerr sat with his hands clasped on the table before him, composed and still. He might have been waiting for a briefing. Katrina Vale had her notebook out, which she closed when Hamish came through the door, with the faint, unapologetic air of someone who does not intend to explain themselves. Hamish stood in the centre of the room and told them simply, and without elaboration, what he had found. He watched each face as he spoke, with the same careful peripheral attention he had given the scene at the jetty, not staring, not obviously cataloguing, but taking in everything and filing it for later consideration. Elspeth Hathersage closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them they were bright, but her face remained still. "An accident," she said. It was not quite a question. "I can't say that yet," Hamish replied, which was the most honest answer, and, he judged, the most useful one for the moment. He explained the situation plainly. The road was impassable, the telephone lines were down, and until one or both of those conditions changed, they were where they were. He was aware that this information would arrange itself differently in each of the 5 minds receiving it, and he watched, from beneath the brim of his mildest manner, the small, involuntary adjustments each of them made to their expressions. Then he began, quietly and without ceremony, to ask questions. Angus, who had positioned himself near the window in the attitude of a man who would rather be somewhere else entirely, told his story again in the same measured, careful terms he had used that morning. He had gone out at 5. He had come back along the shore below the road. He had seen the figure near the old jetty, in the poor light, dragging something heavy. He could not say who it was. "Could you say anything about them?" Hamish asked. "Height, build, the way they were moving?" Angus considered this with the seriousness he gave to everything. "Medium height," he said. "Bulky looking, but that might have been the coat. They were moving deliberately, not panicking." He paused. Whoever it was knew what they were doing. Lena Brodie set down her mug with a sound that was slightly too firm for the conversation. "I never left the hotel," she said. She was looking at Hamish now with the direct, slightly defiant gaze of someone who expects not to be believed, and has decided to lead with the fact anyway. "I went to my room after dinner and I stayed there. I heard the storm, and I stayed in my room." "Did anyone see you go up?" Hamish asked. A pause, brief but present. "I don't know. Mrs. MacPhail, perhaps." Mrs. MacPhail, appealed to across the room, said she had seen Lena on the stairs at about 10:30, which established something but not everything. Elspeth Hathersage said she had taken a sleeping tablet at 11, as she often did in unfamiliar beds, and had heard nothing after that. She said this without apparent self-consciousness, and with the particular, slightly remote precision of someone recounting facts they have already reviewed privately and found to be in order. "Julian sometimes went out at night," she added after a moment. "He was a poor sleeper. I thought nothing of it when he wasn't there this morning." It was said without inflection. Whether that was grief, or relief, or simply exhaustion of a long-accumulated kind, Hamish could not yet say. He noted it, and moved on. Colonel Kerr's account was delivered with military brevity. He had retired at 10:30, he said. He had heard the storm worsen in the night, but had not left his room. He had seen nothing and heard nothing of any significance. He answered each question fully and without hesitation, in the manner of a man who has given statements before and knows precisely how much information to include in each sentence. It was, Hamish reflected, a very polished performance. Whether it was also a true one was a separate question. Dr. McCrae was forthcoming and direct. She had walked near the shore earlier in the evening, she said, at around 9, before the storm had become truly dangerous, to make some final observations of the wave patterns for her notes. She had returned to the hotel by 9:30, wet through and satisfied with her data, and had spent the rest of the night in her room, reading and listening to the storm with the professional interest of someone who finds weather phenomena genuinely absorbing. Katrina Vale said very little, which was the most interesting thing about her contribution. She confirmed she had been in her room, she confirmed she had heard nothing, and then she asked in a polite and carefully casual tone whether Hamish would be speaking to everyone individually. Eventually, Hamish said pleasantly. She smiled and said nothing further. He stood by the window afterward, looking out at the pale, rain-washed village, turning the accounts over in his mind. There were seams in them, small and not yet visible, the way a crack in a stone wall is not visible until the frost has been in it a few times. He did not know yet who had killed Julian Hathersage. He did not have enough for that. But he had enough to know, with the quiet, bone-level certainty that had never yet led him entirely wrong, that he was standing in a room with the person who had. Chapter 5. Suspicion Spreads. By midday, the hotel had become a different kind of place. This was not unusual in Hamish's experience. The discovery of a body does something to an enclosed space, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way a room changes when someone opens a window on a cold day. The warmth is still there, technically, but something has entered that wasn't there before, and everyone feels it without necessarily being able to name it. The guests had dispersed from the dining room after Hamish's questions and reconvened by the invisible but reliable social gravity of shared unease in the lounge. Mrs. MacPhail had lit the fire and produced coffee and shortbread, which no one ate with any real enthusiasm, but which everyone appreciated as evidence that ordinary life was still making some attempt to continue. Willie Lamont moved through the room with the studied unobtrusiveness of a young man who has realised, perhaps for the first time in his life, that being unnoticed is a considerable advantage. Hamish sat in the chair nearest the door, which gave him the room, and if he turned his head slightly, the window and the street beyond it, and drank his coffee and said very little, and watched. It was Lena Brodie who spoke first, which did not surprise him. She had been sitting with her hands folded around her coffee cup in the manner of someone conserving heat they cannot afford to lose, and when she looked up her eyes went directly to Angus Grant with an expression that was not quite accusation, but was near enough to its neighbourhood that the distinction hardly mattered. "You were out there," she said, not loudly, almost conversationally, "on the shore, before anyone else." Angus looked at her with a patience that had a certain worn quality to it, the patience of a man who has expected something unpleasant and has had the small, joyless satisfaction of being right. "I was checking my pots," he said, "at 5 a.m, in that weather." "I've already told Hamish when and why I went out," Angus said, with a deliberate flatness that was as close as he ever came to sharpness. "You hated him," Lena said. She glanced around the room as she said it, not theatrically, but in the way of someone who wants their words to have witnesses. "You made that perfectly clear last night. All of Lochdoub knows how you feel about what he was planning to do to this place." "All of Lochdoub," said Angus, "also knows that feeling isn't the same as doing." It was a good answer. Hamish noted it. "And what about you?" Angus said, not unkindly, but with the steady gaze of a man who has decided that if a stone is to be turned over it might as well be turned all the way. "You had unfinished business with Hathersage. Anyone with 2 eyes could see that last night. What was it that the 2 of you were talking about in the corridor after dinner?" Lena's expression did something complicated and then settled again into stillness. "That's none of your concern," she said. "It might be Hamish's concern," Angus replied. The room had gone very quiet in the way that rooms do when everyone in them has stopped pretending to do something else. Katrina Vale had her hands in her lap and her attention on the middle distance, in the particular posture of a person who is memorising a conversation while appearing not to listen to it. Elspeth Hathersage was looking at the fire. Colonel Kerr had set his cup down and was regarding Lena with an expression that gave nothing away. Dr. McRae, to her credit, said, "This isn't helpful," in the clear, practical tone of a woman who has sat through enough committee meetings to know when a discussion has stopped generating light and started generating heat. "Pointing at each other isn't going to change what happened." "No," said Lena, with a short breath that was not quite a laugh, "but it might change what happens next." Hamish set his cup down quietly on the table beside him. He had been watching the timelines. This was, in the absence of forensics and backup and all the considerable machinery of a modern murder investigation, his primary instrument. People's accounts of where they had been and when they had been there were rarely precise, but imprecision had its own information. The gaps between stated times and the small, unguarded inconsistencies in how those times were described told a story of their own, if you listened to them with sufficient patience. Mrs. Hathersage had taken a sleeping tablet at 11. Dr. McRae had returned from the shore at 9:30. The storm had reached full force by Hamish's own reckoning at 2:30. Angus had left at 5 when the worst had passed. Hathersage himself had, by Angus's account of the weight and position of the figure he had glimpsed, been dead before Angus reached the jetty, which meant the killing, if killing it was, had happened in the window between the storm's peak and Angus's dawn departure, between 2:30 and 5 o'clock in the morning. Someone in this room had been awake and outside and deliberate during those hours when the storm had been at its most punishing, when no sensible person would have ventured out for any reason less urgent than necessity. He thought about that word. Necessity. He looked at Colonel Kerr, who was looking at nothing in particular with the calm, self-contained blankness of a man who had learned, in a long military career, to rest his face while his mind continued to work. He looked at Lena Brodie, whose composure had a brittle quality to it now, like ice that has thawed and refrozen and is no longer quite as reliable as it appears. He looked at Katrina Vale, who chose that precise moment to glance at him, and then look away, which was interesting. He looked at Elspeth Hathersage, who was still watching the fire and whose stillness was of a kind he had not yet fully classified. Grief had many textures. He had seen most of them over the years. What he was watching in Elspeth Hathersage was not the texture he expected, though he could not yet say precisely what it was instead. "I'd like to speak to each of you again," Hamish said, to the room at large, in a tone that was a statement rather than a request. "Individually this afternoon, starting after lunch," he paused. "I'd ask you all to stay in the hotel. The road's still not passable, so there's nowhere to go in any case, but I'd appreciate it if everyone kept together." There was a murmur of assent, the kind that is more compliance than agreement, but which serves the same immediate purpose. He stood and went to the window. The road outside was still, running with a thin sheet of water, though the worst of the flood had begun to drain. The sky had lifted slightly, the bruised purple replaced by a flat, uniform grey that was at least an improvement of sorts. By tomorrow morning, if the forecast held, the road might be passable. The phone lines might be restored. Might be. He turned back to the room. 5 faces, each holding something it had not yet released. A murder committed in the darkest hours of a Highland storm. A fisherman who had seen a figure in the half-light and could not say who it was. A corridor conversation that had not been explained. A financial history that had not yet been fully examined. A retired colonel whose watchfulness the previous evening had seemed, in retrospect, to have rather more to it than idle curiosity. Hamish Macbeth had, in his career, investigated crimes in the full, well-equipped company of the Strathbane Constabulary, and had found it a mixed blessing. The machinery of a proper inquiry had its uses, but it also had its noise, and noise, in his experience, had a way of drowning out the things that mattered most. What he had here was silence and time, and the concentrated smallness of a village holding its secrets tightly in the aftermath of a storm. He had worked with less. Chapter 6. The First Accusation. Lunch was a subdued affair. Mrs. MacPhail had produced soup and bread rolls with the steady, almost defiant competence of a woman who believed, in some deep and fundamental part of herself, that hot food was a moral position. She moved between the tables with the expression of someone who has decided that the best response to a murder on one's premises is to ensure that nobody can complain about the catering, and she achieved this with considerable success. The conversation was sparse and careful, the way conversation always becomes when people are aware that everything they say is being measured against everything they have already said and found, or not found, consistent. Willie Lamont refilled water glasses with unusual frequency, which was his method of remaining in the room without appearing to linger, and which Hamish found entirely understandable. He himself ate his soup and said very little, and thought about Katrina Vale. She had been quiet all morning in a way that was qualitatively different from the quiet of the others. Elspeth Hathersage's quiet was the quiet of shock, or something very like it. Angus Grant's quiet was habitual and decades deep. Even Colonel Kerr's controlled silence had the quality of active suppression, something being held back by evident effort. Katrina's quiet was different. It was the quiet of someone who was waiting, with considerable patience, for the right moment to say something. That moment, it turned out, came over the bread rolls. "I didn't want to say this," she said, to the table in general, in a tone that suggested she had been wanting to say it for some time. "But I think it would be wrong not to." Hamish put down his spoon. "Last night," Katrina continued, "I couldn't sleep. The storm was very loud, and I'm not used to it. I was at my window for quite a long time." She paused with the timing of a woman who understood the value of a pause. "I saw Angus go out. That's not remarkable. He said he went out at 5, and I believe him. But he came back much later than he implied this morning, and when he did come back, he was not only wet, he was muddy. From the knees down, quite heavily muddy, in the way you would be if you'd been struggling on soft ground rather than walking on shingle." The table was very still. Angus Grant looked at her with an expression that was not anger exactly, but had some of anger's temperature to it. "That's not right," he said. "I saw what I saw," Katrina said, pleasantly and firmly, in the manner of a woman who has rehearsed this exchange and is comfortable in it. The effect on the room was immediate and not entirely surprising. Dr. McCrae looked sharply at Angus. Lena Brodie's expression arranged itself into something that was not quite satisfaction, but occupied the same general territory. Elspeth Hathersage pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at nothing. Colonel Kerr, whose face had given nothing away all morning, allowed himself a single, brief, unreadable glance at Angus before returning to his soup. Hamish watched all of it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Angus, your boots." Angus looked at him. "Would you mind fetching your boots?" There was a short silence. Then Angus pushed back his chair and went upstairs with the deliberate, unhurried tread of a man who is under no obligation to hurry for anyone, and came back a few minutes later carrying a pair of heavy rubber waders and setting them on the floor beside the table with a sound that was perfectly calm and slightly pointed. Hamish looked at the boots with the attentive, unhurried care that had, over the years, driven several superior officers at Strathbane to the edge of professional despair. The waders were wet, thoroughly, evenly wet, soaked through from extended immersion, and there were traces of shingle and fine sand caught in the rubber grooves at the sole. There was, however, no mud. Not at the knee, not at the ankle, not anywhere on the outer surface of the boot in any quantity beyond what a man might collect, walking the path from the waterfront to the hotel door. "They've been cleaned," said Katrina, without missing a beat. Hamish considered this. "When did you last clean these?" he asked Angus. "I haven't touched them since I came in this morning," Angus said. "Ask Mrs. MacPhail. I left them in the back hall when I came through." Mrs. MacPhail, who had appeared in the doorway with the coffee pot, confirmed this with the crisp precision of a woman who notices everything that passes through her back hall, and who took a perceptible degree of pleasure in doing so. "Right," Hamish said, and looked at Katrina Vale with the mild, patient expression that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for vagueness. He had been thinking about something she had said. She had described the mud as being below the knee, heavy, of the kind produced by soft ground rather than shingle. She had described this with considerable specificity, the sort of specificity that comes either from very careful observation or from a description that had been prepared in advance, and was therefore slightly over-detailed. He had also been thinking about the shoreline. He had walked the path from the hotel to the old jetty himself, many times in all conditions. Between the hotel and the jetty there was shingle, rock, and the road. The only soft ground in any meaningful proximity to the jetty was above the tide line on the inland side, in the hollow behind the old boat shed, a patch of ground that was marshy at the best of times and entirely boggy after a storm of that magnitude. A man walking from the hotel to the jetty along the shore path would not pass through that hollow. A man approaching the jetty from the landward side, however, might. He noted this carefully and said nothing about it yet. "I don't think," Hamish said, addressing the table in the measured tone of a man announcing a minor administrative conclusion, that the evidence supports what Miss Vale has described. He let that settle for a moment. Angus's boots are consistent with his account. The specific mud she's described would require a route to the jetty that doesn't match his stated path along the shore. Katrina met his gaze with the composed equanimity of a woman who's had her account contradicted before and has not found it fatal. "I know what I saw," she said again, though with marginally less certainty than the first time. "I'm sure you saw something," Hamish said pleasantly. "I'm just not sure it was what you've described." The group released its collective breath in various small individual ways. Angus said nothing, but the line of his shoulders changed slightly. Lena Brodie looked at Katrina with an expression that had shifted from its earlier sympathy towards something more carefully neutral. Colonel Kerr, Hamish noticed, had been watching Katrina throughout the entire exchange, with the particular focused attention he usually reserved for Hathersage, which was a new and interesting development. The suspicion in the room had not dissipated. Suspicion, once introduced into a closed space, tends to persist regardless of the specific target, redistributing itself among those present like heat-seeking equilibrium. What had changed was its direction. It had been aimed squarely at Angus Grant, and now it had swung, not by much, not yet definitely, but perceptibly, toward the woman who had aimed it. Hamish finished his coffee and stood. He had a question he needed to answer, and answering it would require a walk to the old boat shed behind the jetty in the cold and the residual wind to look at a patch of boggy ground that might or might not hold the impression of someone who had no business being there. It was not, he reflected, the afternoon he had planned. But then very little about the last 12 hours had been. Chapter 7. A Narrowing Circle. The ground behind the old boat shed told him several things. Hamish stood at the edge of the hollow for a moment before stepping into it, hands in his pockets, reading the terrain with the unhurried attention of a man who has spent enough years in the Highlands to know that wet ground holds its records faithfully, provided you approach it before the next rain does. The hollow was perhaps 6 metres across at its widest point, sheltered on 3 sides by a low embankment of rough grass, and on the 4th by the back wall of the boat shed itself, which leaned slightly seaward in the manner of a structure that had been arguing with the wind for several decades and had reached an uneasy compromise. The boggy centre was undisturbed. Around the edges, however, where the ground firmed slightly before meeting the embankment, there were impressions, 2 sets of them not overlapping, made at different times, one set going toward the jetty, one returning. The stride was measured and unhurried. The boots were not large. The depth of the impression was consistent with a person of moderate weight moving carefully rather than quickly, which suggested purpose rather than panic. Hamish did not touch anything. He studied the impressions from several angles, noted the direction, noted the tread pattern where it was clear enough to see, and then walked back to the hotel with the particular expression that Willie Lamont, who met him in the back hall, later described to Mrs. MacPhail as the one where he looks like he's working something out but doesn't want you to know he hasn't finished yet. Willie Lamont was, on the whole, a perceptive young man. He had been back in the hotel no more than 20 minutes, and was in the process of making himself a cup of tea in the small room off the back hall that served as a combination of his office, his thinking space, and his repository for the accumulated administrative debris of rural policing, when Mrs. MacPhail came to find him with a face that said something new had happened. "Angus's oilskins," she said, without preamble. He looked at her. "They're gone," she said. "He hung them in the back hall to dry when he came in this morning, beside his waders. The waders are still there. The oilskins are not." Hamish set down his tea. He went to the back hall and confirmed it himself, because confirmation is always worth the 30 seconds it takes. The coat hook beside the waders was bare, and the floor beneath it showed the faint outline of a drip pattern that had since dried. Someone had taken Angus's oilskins from the hook, and had done it carefully enough that neither Mrs. MacPhail nor Willie had noticed until now. He searched the hotel systematically, which took the better part of an hour and required him to explain to Katrina Vale, whom he found in the upstairs corridor in the vicinity of rooms that were not her own, that he would very much appreciate it if everyone remained in the lounge for the next little while. She retreated with good grace and a pleasant smile that did not quite reach her eyes. He did not find the oilskins. What this meant was straightforward enough as far as it went. Angus's coat, the coat he had been wearing when he walked the shore path that morning, the coat that would show whatever the shore path had deposited on it, the coat that could either corroborate or undermine his account of where he had been and how he had got there, had been removed from the building or concealed within it by someone who had a reason to want it gone. He was still considering this when the afternoon gave him something else entirely to think about. It was Willie who found her, coming back from the jetty where Hamish had sent him to keep watch over the site of the body, moving at a pace that was somewhere between urgent and outright running, his face the colour of unpainted plaster. Lena Brodie was on the foreshore path, 30 yards short of the jetty, on her hands and knees in the shingle, with one hand pressed to her right shoulder, and her expression drawn tight with pain. She said she had slipped, which was possible. The path was wet and the shingle loose after the storm. But the angle of her position, and the way she held herself, and the particular quality of her eyes when she looked up at Hamish suggested that slipping was not the complete account. He helped her to her feet and walked her back to the hotel with Willie on the other side and her hand gripping his arm with the focused intensity of a woman concentrating on not showing how much something hurts. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, once she was seated in the lounge with a blanket round her shoulders and Mrs. MacPhail's most authoritative cup of tea in front of her. She was quiet for a moment. The others had gathered at what they apparently considered a tactful distance, which was not a very great distance at all. "I went out to clear my name," she said at last, with a flatness that suggested she was aware of how this sounded. "I wanted to look at the jetty for myself, to see if there was anything that showed I hadn't been there last night." She paused. "I know that's not how it works. I know, but I couldn't just sit here." "And?" Hamish said. "Someone pushed me," she said. "From behind, on the path above the shore where it narrows between the wall and the drop. I didn't hear them coming." She touched her shoulder carefully. "I caught myself before I went all the way down. If I hadn't—" She stopped. The room absorbed this in silence. Hamish looked at the 5 remaining guests, each in their various postures of attention. Someone had left this room, or had never returned to it, in the interval between his search of the hotel and Willie's alarm. He had not been watching them every moment. He had not had the means to. He pulled his chair a fraction closer to Lena's and lowered his voice, not to exclude the others, but to give her the cleaner signal of his full attention. "When you went out," he said, "did you tell anyone where you were going?" A pause. "No." "Did you pass anyone on the way?" She thought about this carefully. The upstairs corridor was empty. The back hall was empty. I went out the side door. Another pause. "But the side door sticks. It makes a noise when you open it." Hamish nodded once slowly. The killer had heard the door, had followed her, had seen where she was going and had decided, for whatever reason, that Lena Brodie walking toward the jetty unsupervised was a problem that required immediate and physical resolution, which meant one of 2 things, or possibly both. Either Lena knew something about what had happened at that jetty in the early hours of the morning, and the killer had calculated, correctly or not, that she was about to find evidence of it, or Lena had said something, or done something, or simply existed in a way that had brought her within range of a person who was becoming less careful and more dangerous in direct proportion to how threatened they felt. Either way, the thing had changed. Up until now, there had been a body and a set of accounts and a collection of half-visible motives. Now there was a second victim, bruised and shaken but ambulatory, which was fortunate, and a killer who had demonstrated a willingness to act in the open, in daylight, when the conditions required it. The circle was narrowing. Hamish was no longer simply looking for the person who had killed Julian Hathersage. He was looking for the person who would kill again if not found, and who was in this building, and who was running out of patience at roughly the same rate that he himself was running out of time. He looked at Luggs, who had stationed himself beside Lena Brodie's chair, with the quiet, proprietary air of a dog who has decided someone needs watching over, and has appointed himself to the role without being asked. It was, Hamish thought, a reasonable instinct. He trusted it. Chapter 8. Hidden Ties. There is a particular kind of thinking that Hamish Macbeth did best when his hands were occupied with something else entirely. He had discovered this about himself early in his career, and had learned to engineer the conditions for it deliberately. Other detectives, he knew, paced, or made charts, or filled whiteboards with arrows and photographs and coloured string in the manner of people who believed that the solution to a problem lay in making the problem sufficiently visible. Hamish's method was different. He made tea, or he tidied things that did not strictly need tidying, or he sat with Luggs and threw a ball at Luggs, brought back with the cheerful, uncomplicated satisfaction of a dog for whom the world contains no unsolved mysteries, and everything is, fundamentally, fine. He settled on the tea. It was mid-afternoon. The light outside had the flat, colourless quality of a Highland winter day that has decided not to commit to anything in particular. The road, which he had checked an hour ago from the upstairs window, was still running with water at the low point past the Sutherland farm. The telephone line remained silent. The world beyond Lochdu was proceeding without them, indifferent to their difficulties, and would continue to do so until the water dropped and the line was restored, which Hamish estimated would be sometime tomorrow morning at the earliest. He had approximately 18 hours. He stood at the kitchen window of the small back room and drank his tea, and let his mind move through what he knew, not pushing it, but allowing it to find its own level, the way water finds the lowest point of a surface without being directed. Colonel Kerr had arrived in Lochdu alone, by hired car from Inverness, with a single bag and the explanation that he was here for fishing and to escape the city. It was the explanation of a man who had prepared one and kept it spare. Hamish had accepted it at the time because it was not, on its face, implausible. Retired military men of a certain age did come to the Highlands for precisely those reasons. But Kerr had watched Hathersage throughout the dinner with an intensity that had nothing recreational about it, and he had watched Katrina Vale this afternoon with the same quality of attention, which suggested that his interest in certain people in this building was not casual and not recent. He thought about Elspeth Hathersage. She described her marriage in the careful abbreviated way that people describe things they have made their peace with, as a long one. She had not described it as a happy one. The sleeping tablets taken in unfamiliar beds, the practised invisibility in her husband's company, the particular quality of her stillness when the news of his death had been delivered, none of these were the responses of a woman in the first shock of unexpected bereavement. They were the responses of a woman who has been managing something for a very long time and has been abruptly relieved of the management of it. Hamish did not think this made her a murderer, but it made her a person with a history, and histories were what he needed. He went to find her. She was in the smaller sitting room at the back of the hotel, which Mrs. MacPhail had tactfully designated as a private space for her use, and which she had furnished with herself and a cup of cold tea and the expression of someone who had been sitting quietly with their own thoughts for several hours and had not found the company entirely comfortable. Hamish knocked on the open door, and she looked up without apparent surprise, as though she had been expecting him or someone very like him, and said, "Come in," in a voice that was steady and a little tired. He sat across from her and asked her, gently and without any particular emphasis, how long she had known Douglas Kerr. The stillness that moved across her face was brief and immediately controlled, but it was there. "A long time," she said. "Before you met your husband?" A pause. "Before I met Julian, yes." She told him the rest of it with the measured, slightly distant composure of someone recounting events that have been thoroughly processed and filed away, and no longer have the power to cause active pain, only a low, persistent ache of the kind one simply incorporates into daily life and stops noticing. She and Douglas Kerr had been engaged in their 20s. It had ended. She did not elaborate on the manner of its ending, and Hamish did not press her, because the specific cause was less important to him at this moment than the fact of it. She had met Julian Hathersage 2 years later. She'd married him. She had not, she said quietly, seen Douglas Kerr again until he walked into the dining room of the Lochdoub Hotel the night before last. "Did your husband know?" Hamish asked. She considered this with evident care. "Not about Douglas specifically," she said. "Julian knew there had been someone before him. He was not a man who found that kind of information comfortable, so I learned early on not to supply it." Hamish nodded. He asked his next question, carefully watching her face as he did. "Do you know whether your husband and Colonel Kerr had any dealings with each other? Professionally, perhaps?" The look she gave him then was not the look of a woman who does not know the answer. It was the look of a woman deciding whether the answer is hers to give. She held it for a moment and then released it. "There was an investment," she said. "Years ago, when Julian was building his portfolio. A scheme. A development in the Borders, I think. Douglas had money in it. A great deal of money from what I understood." She paused. "It failed. Julian moved on to other things. Douglas lost what he had put in, and rather more besides." She looked at her cold tea. "Julian never spoke of it. He never spoke of losses, generally, only of what came next." There it was. Hamish sat for a moment longer, asked a few final procedural questions about the previous evening that she answered steadily and without apparent concealment, and then thanked her and left her with her tea and her thoughts. He found Katrina Vale in the lounge, alone for the first time since morning, reading a book with the slightly unconvincing concentration of a person using a book for its cover rather than its content. She looked up when he came in with an expression of polite expectation that struck him, not for the first time, as extremely well practised. "You're not a travel writer," he said pleasantly, taking the chair across from her. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds before something in her expression quietly rearranged itself. "What makes you say that?" "Travel writers notice places," Hamish said. "You notice people. Specifically, you've been noticing Julian Hathersage since you arrived, and when he died you closed your notebook in a hurry, which is not what a writer does when something extraordinary happens in front of them." A long pause. Then, with what appeared to be genuine if reluctant respect, she closed her book entirely. She had, she explained, been investigating Hathersage for the better part of 2 years. Not as a travel writer. That was the professional covering note she used for access, but as a freelance investigative journalist working in collaboration with an environmental law charity that had been building a case against him for fraudulent environmental assessments and the suppression of survey data on 3 previous development sites. "He knew someone was asking questions," she said. "He didn't know it was me. When the storm trapped everyone here, I thought—" She stopped. "I thought I might find something." "And did you?" Hamish asked. "No," she said, which he believed. Then, after a moment, "But I know where he kept his papers. He had a locked briefcase in his room. If there is a case to be made against what he was planning for Lochdoub, the documentation for it is in there." Hamish considered the briefcase and what it might contain, and what, exactly, it was that Katrina Vale had seen from her window in the pre-dawn dark that she had chosen to describe as mud on Angus Grant's boots. He thought about the boggy hollow behind the boat shed and the 2 sets of careful, unhurried footprints leading toward the jetty and back again. He thought about a man with a great deal to lose, and a long memory, and the patience of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right set of circumstances to finally do something about it. The shape of it was becoming clearer. Not clear enough yet, but clearer. Chapter 9. The Silencing Attempt. Hamish had a conversation with Angus Grant that he had been putting off since morning, not because he was uncertain of the need for it, but because he had learned over many years of talking to men like Angus that timing mattered considerably more than method. A man of Angus's nature would not be drawn out by persistence or by the careful architecture of an interview. He would tell you what he was ready to tell you when he was ready to tell it, and the most effective thing a questioner could do in the meantime was to make the conditions as unstressful as possible and then wait. The conditions were not, on this particular afternoon, especially unstressful. but Hamish judged that the waiting had gone on long enough. He found Angus in the back hall, sitting on the wooden bench beside the coat hooks, where his oilskins were no longer hanging, with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance in the manner of a man conducting a private internal argument. He looked up when Hamish appeared and said nothing, which was his customary greeting and which Hamish had long ago ceased to take personally. Hamish sat down beside him on the bench. For a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was of the comfortable load-bearing variety that requires years of acquaintance to construct. "You saw more than you told me," Hamish said at last, not as an accusation, simply as a statement of a thing they both already knew. Angus was quiet for a while longer. Then he said, "I wasn't certain enough." "Tell me what you weren't certain enough about." Angus turned his hands over on his knees and looked at them. The deeply weathered, broad-knuckled hands of a man who had worked in all weathers for the whole of his adult life. "The light was bad," he said. "I've said that, and it's true. But when I saw the figure on the foreshore, I was close enough to see more than I said." He paused. "The coat." Hamish waited. It was a long coat, dark, heavy material, not oilskins, not a waterproof of the ordinary kind, more like— He stopped and searched for the word. A great coat, military style. It had buttons down the front, brass buttons, I think, though the light was bad enough that I couldn't be certain of the colour. He looked at Hamish. "I didn't say it because I thought, if I was wrong, it would only cause trouble for a man who might be innocent of it, and because—" He paused again. "Because the coat itself might mean nothing. People wear unusual things." "In a Highland storm at 4 a.m, Hamish said mildly. Angus allowed the faintest ghost of something that was not quite a smile. "Aye," he said, "there's that." Hamish sat with this for a moment. A greatcoat, brass buttons, the sort of coat that a retired army colonel might own and might wear, not for its weather resistance, which was not its primary design purpose, but because it was what he had worn for decades in difficult conditions, and because old habits of dress, like old habits of thought, tended to outlast the circumstances that had produced them. He was about to stand when Angus spoke again. "There's something else," Angus said. He said it in a particular way, not reluctantly, but with the careful deliberateness of a man placing a fragile thing down on a surface and hoping it will hold. "I told you I saw the figure dragging something heavy. That's true, but what I didn't say was where they dragged it to." He looked steadily at Hamish. "There's a space under the old jetty, on the landward side, where the storm timbers are stored. It's sheltered from the sea, blocked in on 3 sides. A body left there would be out of the tide's reach." Hamish looked at him. "I think whoever it was moved him there," Angus said, "and then the tide shifted him back out onto the shore before I reached him. The storm surge was running hard even after the wind dropped. It would have been enough. This was important. This rearranged things. It meant the placement of the body on the exposed shingle was not the killer's final intention, but the tide's revision of it. It meant the killer had attempted to conceal the body, at least temporarily, and had been undone by the same storm that had covered the sound of what they had done. It meant a degree of forward-thinking and composure that, in the immediate aftermath of a killing, required either exceptional coldness or exceptional preparation. He thanked Angus and stood up. He had taken 3 steps toward the door when the sound reached him. It was not a loud sound. It was the deep, splintering crack of stressed timber giving way under a load it was no longer able to carry, followed by the heavy, accelerating impact of something substantial falling through an interior space. It came from directly above them, from the upper floor of the hotel, and it was followed immediately by a shout, and then by the particular, reverberating quality of silence that follows a serious accident. Hamish took the stairs at a pace that was somewhere between controlled and urgent, Angus close behind him. The upper corridor was full of plaster dust. One of the large structural beams that ran along the ceiling of the corridor, old timber, decades seasoned, weakened by decades of Highland winters and apparently finished off by the accumulated moisture of the previous night's storm, had come away from its housing in the ceiling and fallen. It lay across the corridor floor at an angle, blocking the passage entirely, its displaced end resting on the floor with the timber still shifting and settling in the slow, reluctant way of a thing that has committed to falling and has not quite finished. Angus was standing 4 feet from it. He had been heading back to his room. If he had been another 4 feet along the corridor when the beam fell, it would have caught him squarely, and Hamish would have been looking at a very different situation. Willie Lamont appeared from the far end of the corridor, wide-eyed, and said in a slightly elevated pitch that the beam had been fine that morning. He was certain of it. He had walked past it a dozen times. Hamish looked at the housing where the beam had been seated in the wall. He looked at it for quite a long time, crouching beside it with his torch because the corridor light had failed when the beam came down, examining the point where the timber had separated from the bracket. The bracket was intact. The housing in the wall was intact. The end of the timber that had been seated in it showed the clear, fresh marks of something that had worked at it, the grain disturbed, the surface abraded in a way that was not consistent with simple, structural failure. He stood up. Willie was watching him. Angus was watching him. From the top of the stairs, Dr. McRae had appeared, and behind her, a few steps back, Colonel Kerr, who was fully dressed and wearing, Hamish noticed with a quality of attention that was now very focused indeed, a dark wool blazer. Not a greatcoat. But the pegs in the back hall had included, alongside the wet waterproofs and walking jackets of the other guests, a single long, dark overcoat with a double-breasted front. Hamish had walked past it 3 times today. He had not, until this moment, examined its buttons. "I need everyone downstairs," he said, in the calm, flat tone he reserved for moments when what he felt and what he needed to project were not the same thing. "Please, now. The corridor isn't safe." They went. Kerr last of all, unhurrying, with the measured descent of a man who sees no reason to move at someone else's pace. Hamish stood at the top of the stairs for a moment after the others had gone down, alone in the settling plaster dust, and thought about a man with military training and a great deal of focused, long-contained anger, and what such a man might do when he felt the walls beginning to close. He thought about the coat on the peg in the back hall, and the buttons he had not yet seen closely enough to describe. He thought about Angus Grant, 4 feet from where that beam had come down. The beam had not fallen. It had been persuaded, and whoever had persuaded it had done so because Angus had seen too much from a dark foreshore at dawn, and because the detail of a military-style coat with brass buttons, once spoken aloud in the presence of the right person, had made Angus Grant a problem that the killer had decided, with the same cold practicality that had carried him through everything else, could not be allowed to continue. Hamish went downstairs quietly, with his mind entirely made up about one thing at least. He was not going to let Angus Grant out of his sight. Chapter 10. The Calm and the Truth. The telephone line came back at 7:45 the following morning. Hamish knew this because he was sitting beside it, which he had been doing in one capacity or another since 6 o'clock, and when it rang he picked it up before the first tone had properly finished and spoke to the duty sergeant at Strathbane with a brevity and precision that left the sergeant, who had expected a long and leisurely rural complaint about flood damage, slightly winded. He requested officers and a scene of crime team, gave the particulars in the compressed, efficient manner that always surprised people who had formed their opinion of him from his customary conversational pace, and was told they would reach him within 2 to 3 hours depending on road conditions. 2 to 3 hours. He put the phone down and went to the window. The sky had cleared overnight to a pale, washed blue that was almost offensive in its serenity, after everything the previous 36 hours had produced. The loch was still. The road, from what he could see, had a clear surface at least as far as the Sutherland farm, which meant conditions were improving. The mountains had come back from behind the clouds and were standing there, massive and immovable and entirely untroubled by what had been happening at their feet, the way mountains always are. He turned from the window and went to wake Mrs. MacPhail, who took the news that the police were coming with a relief so visible it was almost moving, and who immediately put on a pot of coffee large enough to address the requirements of a small constabulary. He told her he needed everyone in the dining room by 9 o'clock. He spent the intervening hour doing 3 things. The first was examining the coat on the peg in the back hall, which he had asked Mrs. MacPhail to ensure remained untouched from the moment the corridor beam had fallen. It was a long, dark overcoat, navy blue, heavy wool, double-breasted, of a cut that had been military in origin if not in current application. The buttons were brass, 8 of them down the front, 2 on each cuff. They were not new buttons. The gilt had worn slightly at the highest point of each one in the way of metal that has been handled and unfastened over many years. One of the lower buttons had a small nick in its edge, consistent with having been struck against stone or hard shingle. He noted this, touched nothing, and moved on. The second thing was a conversation with Katrina Vale, conducted quietly in the corridor outside her room at 8 o'clock, in which he asked her to tell him, as precisely as she could recall, what she had actually seen from her window in the early hours of the previous morning, before she had decided, for whatever reason, to translate it into an accusation against Angus Grant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I saw someone come back to the hotel. Along the road, not the shore path. It was dark and I couldn't see the face, but the coat was distinctive." She paused. "I panicked. I thought if I said what I had actually seen, and it pointed where it pointed, and I was wrong, I would have—" She stopped. "I had no proof. I have spent 2 years building a careful, documented case, and I know what happens when you accuse powerful men without sufficient evidence. I didn't want to be dismissed." "So you redirected it," Hamish said. "Yes." She said it without excuse, which he appreciated. "I'm sorry. I know what it nearly cost Angus." The third thing he did was go and sit with Luggs for 10 minutes in the back room, which was not strictly investigative, but which was, he had found, generally necessary before he did something difficult. Luggs sat beside him and put his large warm head on Hamish's knee and looked up at him with the uncomplicated sympathy of a creature for whom the world's problems were significant only insofar as they affected the person he had chosen to be responsible for. It was, Hamish had always thought, an entirely reasonable approach to existence. He scratched Luggs behind the ears and then stood up and went to do what needed doing. They were all in the dining room by 9, arranged around the large central table in the particular formation of people who have been told to gather but have not been told why, and who are consequently not quite sure where to put themselves. Mrs. MacPhail had provided coffee and had then positioned herself near the sideboard with the expression of a woman who intends to stay for the whole of whatever is about to happen, and who dares anyone to suggest otherwise. Willie Lamont stood near the door with his arms folded in what he clearly imagined was an authoritative posture, and which was in fact rather endearing. Hamish stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn, unhurrying, and then began. He told the story in the order it had actually happened, not in the order he had understood it, which was different enough to matter. He described the storm and the window it had created. He described the figure on the foreshore as Angus had truly seen it, not a vague, unidentifiable shape, but a person in a long dark coat with brass buttons, moving with deliberate purpose along the landward side of the shore, taking the body to the shelter of the old jetty, and the tide undoing that concealment before dawn had properly arrived. He described the footprints in the hollow behind the boat shed, made by someone who had come from the hotel, not from the shore, and returned the same way. He described the beam in the corridor, and the marks on the timber that had nothing to do with structural fatigue and everything to do with a person who had heard a fisherman beginning to remember the details of what he had seen, and had decided the remembering needed to stop. He described the coat on the peg in the back hall, and the brass buttons, and the nick on the lower button that was consistent with contact against the stone of the jetty's landward face. Throughout all of this, Colonel Douglas Kerr sat very still. It was not the stillness of shock, or of fear, or of a man caught by surprise. It was the stillness of a man who had always understood, at some level, that this moment would come, and who had decided long before it arrived how he would conduct himself within it. There was something almost formal about it. The upright posture, the hands flat on the table, the expression that gave nothing away, and Hamish, watching it, found it more unsettling in its way than protest would have been. "You arranged to meet him at the jetty," Hamish said, "in the worst of the storm when no one would be about. You told him you wanted to discuss terms, a negotiation perhaps, or an acknowledgement of what he owed you. He went because he believed you were in a position to cause him difficulty, and men like Hathersage always attend to difficulties personally." He paused. "He ruined you. Years ago. He took what you had built and he left you with nothing, and he never once looked back because that was the kind of man he was and you both knew it." Kerr said nothing. "The coat is in the back hall," Hamish said. "The buttons match what Angus saw. Your footprints are in the hollow behind the boat shed, and when I told this room, on the morning after the body was found, that Hathersage had been discovered below the jetty, you described the exact position of his body. The arm extended, the way he was lying." Hamish looked at him steadily. "I had not said anything about the position of the body. Nobody had. The only person who could have known that detail was the person who had put him there." The room was utterly still. Elspeth Hathersage looked at Kerr with an expression that contained, in it, the compressed weight of several decades of things unsaid, and said nothing now either. Kerr looked at the table. Then he looked up at Hamish, with something in his face that was not quite defiance and not quite resignation, but occupied the space between them with a kind of exhausted dignity. "He destroyed everything I had," he said. It was said quietly and without passion, in the tone of a man stating a simple and well-established fact. He did it knowingly, and he was going to come here and do it again, to this place, to these people, and there would have been no consequence for him whatsoever. He paused. "There never was." "No," Hamish said after a moment. "There wasn't." He said it without judgment, because judgment was not his part in this. His part was to find the truth and hold it steady until the proper machinery arrived to take it from him, which it would do within the hour. He heard the sound of a vehicle on the road outside, the first vehicle in 36 hours, and Lugs, from the back room, raised a brief informational bark. Kerr was arrested in the end, with the same precise composure he had brought to everything else, standing to meet the officers as they came through the door, as though rising to greet them at a formal occasion, his hands already extended. Later, when the hotel had emptied of police and statements, and the organised, purposeful noise of an investigation that had arrived after the investigator had already finished, Hamish sat at the end of the jetty in the pale afternoon light with Lugs beside him, and watched the loch settle back into itself. The water was very clear now, after the storm, the way water always is when everything has been thoroughly disturbed, and then allowed to come to rest again. The mountains were reflected in it without distortion. A single fishing boat, Angus's back where it belonged, moved slowly across the far end of the bay. In a place as small as Lochdu, the truth had nowhere to hide for long. Hamish had always found that a comfort. He threw a stone into the water and watched the reflection shatter and reform, and Lugs looked up at him with the patient, inquiring expression of a dog who is ready whenever his person is to go home. Hamish stood, pulled his cap straight, and walked back along the shore path to where the village waited, quiet and intact and entirely itself as it always was, and, if he had anything to say about it, always would be.